Hey everybody, it's my favorite day of the year. If you've been around the channel, you know that day is New Tolkien Book Day. And today we are discussing what is a pretty exciting new book because this isn't just a reissue or a new deluxe edition, as fun as those are, of old Tolkien books. This is a new revised and expanded edition of the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. Now today I'm going to cover what this book is, what it is not, as well as what kind of new material you can expect to find. I'll give you some of my personal favorites of what I've read, and of course I'll give my thoughts on this book as a new addition to the bookshelf as well. Now first off, what this book is, it is, as I said, a revised and expanded edition of the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. Now the easy part of this book here is that it is expanded, and there are in fact 154 new letters to be found in this book. There's a lot of new stuff about publishing and the road to publishing The Lord of the Rings in particular. There's a good amount of letters to and about family, and there are some new bits about Middle-earth itself. Now, I've had some people send me posts online of people freaking out over what the term revised in this book means. There's some pretty crazy theories out there of the tinfoil hat variety. And there's two ways that this book is revised from the previous edition that we've had for the past 40 years. One way is that some letters are now longer than they were before. For example, letter 131, a very, very famous Tolkien letter, is now 40% longer. And there are some things like a single word that was illegible when Humphrey Carpenter published this back in the 80s. But in the 40 years since, those words have been deciphered, no doubt, thanks in part to Christopher Tolkien himself. So they've been updated in this new volume. So a lot of people have been asking, how did we get this book and why is it different from the version that we've had before? Well, if you're familiar with the story, Humphrey Carpenter, with a lot of help from Christopher Tolkien, assembled these letters back in the late 70s, early 80s. The first volume was published in 1981. And Humphrey Carpenter published this massive collection of Tolkien letters. And frankly, they had way more material than their publisher, Allen and Unwin back then, thought could be published in an affordable way. Now, as you can tell, comparing the two books, their sizes are quite different. And so the publisher back then thought they would either have to break it into two volumes or make it a big volume like this, which would cost more, and they didn't think that there would be the same market. So they trimmed this book down to a more reasonable size, and we got the 1981 version of the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, which focuses a lot more heavily on Middle-earth because that's frankly what most of the audience was most interested in at that time. Christopher had just published Unfinished Tales, and a few years before that, Humphrey Carpenter had published his Tolkien biography, and Christopher had published The Silmarillion. So they trimmed it down, focused a bit more on the Middle-earth side of things, and we got the book that we know and love today. So what we're getting here is basically that original manuscript for the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. Like I said before, there's 154 new letters in this book, and there's 45 that have had material restored. Now, a big question ever since this book was announced was, how will they organize all the new letters? Because back in 1981, they put them all in chronological order. But they cut out a lot of letters all throughout the chronology. So how would they do it when it comes to this new publication? Because if they reordered everything and renumbered everything, it would basically throw us into complete chaos. We tend to reference Tolkien letters in much the same way that you would reference books of the Bible, after all. So if they change the numbering system completely, you can imagine the kind of chaos that the last 40 years of scholarship would go into. Thankfully, HarperCollins has, I think, done the best option that they had available to themselves, which is putting the letters in chronological order, but giving letter assignments to the new letters that fall between existing ones. So famous letters like 131 still has that same number, but now we can refer to new letters by designations such as 254A. Now, one quick organizational note that will be interesting to see play out, Jeremy from the Tolkien Guide pointed out that letters 219 and 220 have actually been switched in the book. And this is due to the date of one of those letters was discovered to be incorrect in the original version. So if you come across to one of those somewhere in a paper or an article, that could get a little tricky. Other than that, I feel like the folks at HarperCollins have done a really good job of organizing this book in the least chaotic way possible. All right, so the big question everybody wants to know, what's new in this book? And if you want a complete breakdown, I'm going to reference you guys to Tolkien Guide. I'll put their link in the description. They've done a phenomenal job of summarizing all the new letters, all the expanded letters. They have a marvelous website that I'll tell you more about in a bit. Obviously, there's way more that's new in this book than I could probably lay out in a concise review video. But I do want to share a few that I personally really enjoy so far, and ones that friends of mine in the fandom have also found a lot of value in. There's quite a bit of new letters here where Tolkien is corresponding with his family or talking about family issues, giving guidance to his kids, stuff like that. Tolkien Guide puts it at about 40% of the new material is family related. In letter 38A, we find a letter that Tolkien wrote to his son Michael, where he finds out where Michael is now stationed through neighbors instead of from Michael himself sending a letter. And these neighbors are the parents of a girl that Michael fancied. And I really like this letter because you see this fatherly love shine through, and he's trying to give advice to his son and say, hey, maybe tell your parents so they don't find out from random people big news in your life. And he puts it in such a loving way. And it's something that I think any father can probably relate to. If you were to go through something similar, nowadays we would probably send a text message and say, dude, come on, seriously, bud? And then there's some of a more serious nature, where in 254A we see him sending a letter to Christopher, and he's kind of lamenting the state of the church. Now, while this stuff obviously doesn't have a bearing on what happened to the Blue Wizards or the nature of Tom Bombadil or anything like that, I personally love seeing this side of Tolkien as a father first and foremost. As a dad, I find it really relatable, this loving care and concern that he has for his kids. And you can see how he has this genuine concern for his family, where he wants to steer them down the right path in life. And then we have another big category that is Tolkien talking about the publishing side of his life. And Tolkien Guide puts that at about 34% of the new material. And this is a lot of back and forth with his publisher. You'll see some letters where he's talking about the cover designs for The Lord of the Rings as he's working to get those books published. And then there's some really fun and wholesome personal connections in some of these letters. So, for example, in 73A, Tolkien is writing to his son Christopher because he just realized that there is an R. Unwin who he's been teaching at school, and this is actually the small boy grown up now who originally read the Hobbit manuscript and told his dad to publish it. Now, what might be my favorite expanded letter in this whole book is 131 that I've mentioned a couple times. This is a monumental Tolkien letter. It gets quoted all the time. And here we find it, as I said earlier, 40% longer. And I can understand why it was trimmed down for the original publication, because a huge chunk of what is restored here is Tolkien's own summary of the entire story of The Lord of the Rings. He basically takes the 6 books that comprise The Lord of the Rings and describes each book in about 3 or so paragraphs. Now, of course, we know the story of The Lord of the Rings quite well, so maybe a summary isn't the most fascinating thing for you, but I do think it's interesting to see what Tolkien focuses on when he's got a finite amount of space to describe The Lord of the Rings when he's writing to Milton Waldman. But in addition to that, probably the most fun thing that I found in this book is Tolkien lays out his ambitious plan for everything he wants to publish in this Middle-earth legendarium. He lays it out in Tales of the First Age, Tales of the Second Age, and Tales of the Third Age. And what's of particular interest here is the Tales of the First Age. Now, to look at this, set aside your definition of the Silmarillion for just a moment. So don't think of the Silmarillion as what we got in published form that has, writings from all throughout the First Age. We find what Tolkien refers to as the Silmarillion as really focusing on the story around the Silmarils. So we have a short bit of the music of the Ainur, and then we have the history of the Eldar, which weaves in those stories dealing with the Silmarils. And this is what he refers to as the Silmarillion, and he estimates that it would be about the size of The Hobbit itself. He then goes on to list off some shorter things that he has in mind, like the shape of the world and descent of tongues, the Annals of Valinor and the Annals of Beleriand. And then, of course, he lists off his 3 great tales of the First Age, the Children of Húrin, the Fall of Gondolin, and the Tale of Beren and Luthien. He then talks about what he would do in terms of Tales of the Second Age, which he says would each be about the size of a long chapter, one being the Rings of Power, that's talking about the second Dark Lord Sauron and his attempt to enslave the world, and the second one would be the Fall of Númenor, which of course would talk about Sauron coming to that realm and corrupting it and bringing about its downfall before the last alliance rallies to defeat Sauron at the end of the Second Age and the ruling ring is lost. And then from that point in the letter, it goes back to what was originally in letter 131, which goes into the tales of the Third Age, which we know from The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings are published, and we have the appendices. Some of the things in the appendices are mentioned there. Personally, I just think it's really cool to see this kind of mapped out vision for what Tolkien hoped to publish throughout his legendarium at this snapshot point in time in 1951. And as sad as it is that he didn't get to fully finish all these tales, it's kind of a testament to Christopher as well that we're familiar with so many of these stories, at least the versions of them that were possible to get. Now, the final category that I'll talk about of writings in this book is media related. So this is things like adaptations or potential adaptations of The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien Guide puts this at 3% of the new material, and there's a few more letters revolving around those early attempts at adapting Lord of the Rings. Now, you may be familiar with the existing letter 210, where Tolkien famously takes to task the Zimmerman script. But here we get a new letter where Tolkien talks about meeting with Ackerman and some of the reps who are behind that attempt to produce The Lord of the Rings. And what I think is kind of cool in this one is that he calls out the artwork that he was presented with. He was shown some storyboards for Lord of the Rings, and he says that he actually quite likes the artwork. And he talks about a Mr. Cobb, and this Mr. Cobb is Ron Cobb, who would go on to do a lot of impressive concept art for films that you have no doubt seen, including Star Wars, specifically the Cantina scene, Alien, Last Starfighter. He worked on the failed attempt at adapting Dune back before Star Wars, and many other films. But at this time, he was just a 20-year-old kid, and Tolkien acknowledged the talent that this guy clearly had. Tolkien says, Cobb's taste and style seems on the whole to fit The Lord of the Rings better than I should have thought possible. And he's really complimentary of Cobb and the visuals both before and after this, but it goes on to say, but in any case, the visual art is not of such a superlative order that it could carry the stupidities and vulgarities of the script. And I can't read this without laughing. Oh my gosh, it's so good. I don't see how you can't love this guy. And I like this because it shows that Tolkien had nuance. We knew this already, but he had nuance when it came to attempts to adapt his work. And it's nice to look and see how he could appreciate the beauty of the art, even if ultimately the writing of this proposed adaptation wasn't to his liking. I feel like there might be some applicability here. Now, obviously, I am very excited about this book, and I'm going to highly recommend it for anyone who either already loves Tolkien's letters or who has thought about getting into them but hasn't taken the plunge yet. This is the perfect time to do it because we're all going to be poring over this new material and talking about it, and it's a great time to jump in. And honestly, I hope there's more to come. For those of you who aren't familiar, there are a ton more Tolkien letters out there. This is already a pretty beefy book, but there is potential for a volume 2. Over at Tolkien Guide, I've mentioned them a couple times already, but they have a wonderful guide to Tolkien's letters that have summaries of letters that even aren't in this book. Right now, I think the number is over 700, and they've got plenty more that they haven't added yet. So I really hope that this book gets other Tolkien fans as excited as I am about it. I hope that it sells well and, shows the publishers that there's a market and an interest and a hunger for more of Tolkien's letters. Because I'd really love to see a volume 2 of this someday, where we get even more, whether it's tidbits of Middle Earth, more of, Tolkien talking to his family. Everything he writes is so poetic, and I always cherish whenever we're able to read things that we haven't been able to read before from the pen of J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, I've mentioned him a couple times already, but be sure to check out TolkienGuide.com. They've got a wonderful guide on Tolkien's letters. So if you kind of want to focus your reading of this new edition on the new stuff, they've got a guide on there that points you in the right direction there. If you want to check out some summaries of stuff that's not published in here, that's also a great place to go, and to kind of broaden your horizons on what other kinds of writings might be out there if we were to ever get a second volume. And finally, I will also shout out to Chris Smith over at HarperCollins, who put this volume together. His name won't appear on the cover. Humphrey Carpenter, with the help of Christopher Tolkien, obviously put that original manuscript together, but I'm sure no small amount of work went into re-expanding this volume, if that's the correct terminology. I'm sure he had his work cut out for him, and I really like the book that they've come up with, and I will always cherish the ability to read new letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, if you want to pick up this book for yourself, there are some links in the description that do help out the channel, so I'd love it if you guys would use those. If not, that's cool too. Be sure to hit that subscribe button. We are getting so close to 1 million subscribers. But in the meantime, happy reading, enjoy new material from J.R.R. Tolkien, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.